Mountaineering can be one of the most extreme and unforgiving pursuits on Earth. Even the most experienced climbers can find themselves at the mercy of the mountains. From sudden storms to avalanches and human error, the risks are immense, and when things go wrong, the consequences can be catastrophic. In this video, we'll take a look at some of the worst mountaineering disasters in history, what happened, who survived, and how these tragedies changed the climbing world forever. At 8,611 meters, K2 is the second highest peak in the world. For every 4 climbers who reach the summit, 1 doesn't make it back down. The mountain is unpredictable, brutal, and completely unforgiving. And in 1986, it delivered one of its deadliest seasons ever. 13 climbers lost their lives. The first tragedy struck on June 21st, when an American expedition attempted to climb the unclimbed Southwest Pillar, aka the Magic Line, a bold and dangerous route. John Smolik and Alan Pennington were killed by an avalanche. Pennington's body was recovered, but Smolik was lost forever beneath the ice and rock. With 2 climbers gone, the rest of the team abandoned their attempt and left the mountain. Just 2 days later, on June 23rd, Wanda Rutkiewicz, Liliane Berard, and Maurice Berard stood on the summit of K2. Rutkiewicz became the first woman to ever summit K2. As the team descended in the dark, they were forced to bivouac near the summit, exposed to the deadly cold. The next day, as they made their way down, the couple disappeared. Liliane's body was found 3 weeks later, frozen on the mountainside, but Maurice's wasn't discovered until 1998, 12 years after he vanished. The deaths continued into July. On July 10th, Polish climber Tadeusz Piotrowski fell to his death after a successful summit via a new route on the south face of K2. Just 6 days later, Italian climber Renato Casarotto met a similar fate while attempting a solo climb of the Southwest Pillar. He fell into a crevasse on the way back to base camp. By August 3rd, K2 had already taken 6 lives, and it wasn't slowing down. That day, Polish-Slovak climber Wojciech Wrusz fell to his death after successfully summiting the Southwest Pillar without oxygen. The next day, on August 4th, Muhammad Ali, a Pakistani climber working as a guide for a South Korean team, was killed by falling rocks while attempting the Abruzzi Spur route. K2 had already claimed 8 lives that summer when Alan Rouse was leading a British expedition, attempting the Northwest Ridge, a rarely used, brutally difficult route. His team struggled to establish camps, and one by one, the climbers gave up. Rouse refused to quit. When his teammates descended, he stayed behind, convinced he still had a chance. That was when he met another group, 6 climbers from Austria, Poland, and Britain, who were taking the more common Abruzzi Spur route. The newly formed group pushed higher, reaching Camp 4 at 8,000 meters, the final stop before the summit. But instead of making their attempt immediately, they waited 1 extra day. That single decision sealed their fate. The weather was shifting and time was running out, but on August 4th, they went for the summit. Rouse and Polish climber Dobroslawa Wolf led the way. The climb was exhausting. Wolf quickly fell behind and was forced to turn back, leaving Rouse alone. Higher up, 2 Austrians, Willi Bauer and Alfred Emitzer, caught up to him just 100 meters from the top. The 3 reached the summit at 4 p.m., making Rouse the first British climber to stand on K2's peak. But it was late in the day and a storm was rolling in. As they descended, they found Wolf asleep in the snow, her body shutting down from exhaustion. They shook her awake and convinced her to keep moving. Just as they were making their way down, they ran into Kurt Diemberger and Julie Tullis, still climbing up. The summit window was already closing, and Rouse and the others begged them to turn back. But they didn't. They kept climbing. By the time Diemberger and Tullis reached the top at 7 p.m., the situation had turned into a full-scale disaster. The wind was howling, the temperature was dropping, and daylight was fading. They had no choice but to descend in total darkness. By the time they all made it back to Camp 4, hurricane-force winds were tearing across the mountain, with temperatures plummeting below -40 degrees Celsius. Visibility was gone. Trapped in their tents, the climbers were barely clinging to life. On August 6th, Tullis collapsed. Her lungs were filling with fluid, a condition known as high-altitude pulmonary edema, HAPE. She never woke up. The remaining climbers lay in their tents, barely conscious, as the storm raged on for 3 more days. By August 10th, the snow finally stopped, but the temperature dropped even lower. The surviving climbers had no choice. They had to move. But Rouse was too weak to walk. His body had given up. The others, barely alive themselves, had to leave him behind. Descending was just as deadly. Alfred Imitzer, an Austrian climber, Hannes Weiser, collapsed only a few hundred feet from Camp 4, unable to go any further. The others tried to revive them, but they were gone. Wolf, the last to leave, never made it back either. A year later, climbers found her still attached to the fixed ropes, frozen solid, leaning against the rock wall. That left just 2 survivors, Bauer and Diemberger. But Camp 3 had been destroyed by the storm, leaving them with nowhere to stop. Somehow, they made it down to Camp 2, where a rescue team finally found them. By the time they reached base camp, both had suffered severe frostbite, losing multiple fingers and toes. By the end of the season, 13 climbers were dead. While Wanda Rutkiewicz made history as the first woman to summit K2, Alan Rouse had also made history as the first British climber to summit K2. But unlike her, he never made it home. Marmolada, the tallest peak in the Dolomites, had been a favorite for climbers for decades. It stood 3,343 meters high, a stunning mountain with breathtaking views. But on July 3, 2022, it became the site of one of the worst disasters in recent alpine history. A massive chunk of glacier collapsed, sending an avalanche of ice and rock crashing down the northern slope. Within moments, 11 climbers were dead, 8 more were injured, and a peaceful summer day turned into chaos. The conditions leading up to the collapse had been a recipe for disaster. In the days before, the region experienced a severe heat wave, pushing temperatures to 10 degrees Celsius at the summit, far too warm for a glacier that should have been frozen solid. The previous winter had brought less snow than usual, stripping away the glacier's natural insulation. Beneath the surface, meltwater had been pooling, weakening the ice from the inside out. Then, on July 3, 2022, at 1:45 p.m., the Serac gave way. A slab of ice 260 feet wide and 80 feet high snapped off and plunged down the slope. Hikers, mountaineers, even experienced alpine guides, all caught in the path of destruction. The debris shot down the slope, stopping nearly a mile away near the Fedaya Reservoir. Rescue teams rushed into action. Helicopters hovered over the wreckage, scanning for survivors. Thermal drones searched for heat signatures beneath the ice. 6 bodies were recovered that day, another the next, and 4 more over the following 3 days. The last victim was identified through DNA testing on July 9th. The dead included 9 Italians and 2 Czech climbers, many of them experienced mountaineers. Among them were 2 mountain guides, leading clients on what should have been a routine climb. 8 survivors were airlifted to hospitals across northern Italy. Some suffered severe fractures, frostbite, and critical injuries. 2 German climbers were among those rescued. Others were trapped under ice and debris, their bodies recovered days later. Scientists pointed to climate change as a major factor. The Marmolada Glacier had been shrinking for years, losing ice at an alarming rate. A lake had been forming beneath the glacier, and water had been seeping into cracks, weakening the structure without anyone realizing it. When the Serac finally broke off, it released seismic energy comparable to a 0.6 magnitude earthquake. The disaster sent shockwaves through Italy. Prime Minister Mario Draghi visited the rescue base in Canazei, where families of the victims waited for news. The Pope called for greater awareness of humanity's impact on nature. Authorities stepped up glacier monitoring efforts, but the truth was clear. This wouldn't be the last collapse. The mountains were changing, and Marmolada had delivered a deadly warning. Lenin Peak, standing at 7,134 meters, has always had a deceptive reputation. It's often called the easiest 7,000-meter climb, attracting mountaineers from around the world. But in July 1990, the mountain revealed just how ruthless it could be. What started as an ambitious international expedition ended in the deadliest mountaineering disaster in history, all in the span of a few terrifying seconds. The journey to Lenin Peak is both beautiful and brutal. Climbers typically start in the city of Osh, Kyrgyzstan, before making the 7-hour drive to base camp at 11,800 feet. From there, they move to advanced base camp at around 14,000 feet. But the real challenge comes at Camp 2, known as the Frying Pan, a deceptively flat area at 17,388 feet, where the sun's reflection off the ice can roast climbers during the day, only for temperatures to plummet at night. This was where the disaster unfolded. In the summer of 1990, a team of 45 climbers from multiple countries had gathered for the climb. 23 of them were from the Leningrad Mountaineering Club, a group with a strong reputation in Soviet climbing circles. Others came from Czechoslovakia, Israel, Switzerland, and Spain. They were skilled mountaineers. On July 13th, the weather had been challenging. Heavy snowfall had persisted for days, and the risk of avalanches was growing. But that evening, the sky cleared, and the climbers at Camp 2 felt a brief sense of relief. What they didn't know was the danger was lurking just above them. At 9:30 p.m., a 6.4 magnitude earthquake struck deep beneath the Hindu Kush Mountains in Afghanistan, over 130 miles away. The tremors were too deep to be felt on Lenin Peak, but they triggered something catastrophic: a massive serac collapse from the neighboring Chapaev Peak. A towering block of ice, the size of a multi-story building, broke loose and plunged straight toward Camp 2. There was no warning. The avalanche, moving at over 150 miles per hour, slammed into the camp with the force of an exploding bomb. Tents, climbers, gear, everything was wiped out in seconds. The entire camp was buried under an impenetrable layer of ice and snow. Out of 45 climbers, only 2 survived. Alexei Korin from Russia and Miroslav Brozman from Slovakia somehow avoided being crushed. The force of the avalanche had tossed them down the mountain, leaving them buried but alive. Korin had a broken arm, while Brozman's leg was shattered. Freezing in shock, and with no proper gear, they had only one option: descend. In nothing but sleeping clothes, they crawled and staggered through miles of deep snow, desperate for help. As the night dragged on, Brozman collapsed, unable to continue. Korin, knowing he couldn't carry his companion, covered him with whatever fabric they had left and pushed forward alone. Hours later, he finally stumbled upon a rescue team. The rescue operation that followed was one of the most difficult in mountaineering history. Helicopters were sent up, search teams scoured the slopes, but the reality was grim. 43 climbers were gone. The avalanche had compacted into solid ice, trapping the victims too deep for recovery. Of all the bodies, only 4 were ever found. The rest remained entombed in the glacier, frozen in time. For years, the mountain held on to its dead. But in 2008, as glaciers in the region began melting due to climate change, human remains and climbing gear started emerging from the ice, a haunting reminder of that tragic night. Of course, this video wouldn't be complete without the most infamous mountaineering disaster of all time, the 1996 Mount Everest disaster. By May 1996, the commercialization of Everest had reached its peak. More climbers than ever were paying tens of thousands of dollars to guides who promised to take them to the top of the world. That season, 398 climbers pushed beyond base camp, all chasing the same goal. But Everest is a gamble, and that year, 12 people wouldn't make it back down. Among them were 2 of the world's top guides, Rob Hall and Scott Fisher. Hall, the New Zealander who had summited Everest 5 times, ran Adventure Consultants, a company that specialized in getting inexperienced climbers to the top. Fisher, the American climber with a reputation for toughness, led Mountain Madness, a more aggressive guiding service that prided itself on pushing limits. The 2 teams had planned their summit attempts for May 10th, but what was supposed to be a smooth climb turned into one of Everest's deadliest disasters. The trouble started before they even reached the summit. That morning, 33 climbers left Camp 4, battling exhaustion and thin air as they climbed into Everest's death zone. They moved painfully slow, delayed by bottlenecks at the Hillary Step and missing fixed ropes that should have been set up hours earlier. The rule was simple: turn around by 2 p.m. no matter what. But that day, guides ignored their own advice. By 3 p.m., climbers were still scrambling to the top, celebrating their summit victories even as storm clouds gathered below. By 4 p.m., Hall was still at the top, waiting for Doug Hansen, one of his clients, who was struggling to descend. Fisher, already exhausted and showing signs of altitude sickness, had barely made it to the top and was too weak to descend quickly. Then the storm hit. By 5 p.m., Everest's summit ridge had turned into a whiteout nightmare. Winds howled at 70 miles per hour, snow buried the fixed ropes, and temperatures plummeted to minus 40 degrees Celsius. The climbers couldn't see their own feet, let alone the way down. Some wandered in circles, others collapsed where they stood. On the South Col, a group of climbers, including Beck Weathers, Yasuko Namba, and 3 others from Mountain Madness and Adventure Consultants, got completely lost. With visibility near zero, they huddled together, trying to wait out the storm. At some point, Namba stopped responding. Weathers, blinded by frostbite, slipped into a coma-like state. The guides assumed they were dead and left them behind. At the balcony, Fisher lay alone, too weak to move. His lead Sherpa, Lopsang Jongbu, tried to save him, but eventually had to leave him behind to survive. A few hundred feet above, Rob Hall refused to abandon Doug Hansen, even as his own oxygen ran out. The last radio transmission from Hall was to his pregnant wife, Jan Arnold, back in New Zealand. "Sleep well, my sweetheart," he told her. "Please don't worry too much." Hall froze to death overnight, still clipped to the ropes just below the summit. Hansen and Fisher didn't survive the night either. Meanwhile, something unbelievable happened. At noon the next day, nearly 24 hours after being left for dead, Beck Weathers woke up. Despite severe frostbite, snow blindness, and hypothermia, he stood up and walked, alone, back to camp. The climbers at Camp 4 couldn't believe their eyes. He was barely alive, his face frozen solid, his hands blackened with frostbite, but he was moving. A high-altitude rescue team evacuated him in one of the highest helicopter rescues in history. By the time the storm cleared, 8 climbers were dead, including Hall, Fisher, Namba, Hansen, and 3 Indo-Tibetan border police officers who had tried to summit from the north side. The survivors were scarred for life, physically and emotionally. Weathers lost his right hand, half his left hand, and his nose. Others suffered severe frostbite and trauma. The 1996 Everest disaster became one of the most infamous tragedies in mountaineering history. It sparked global debates about commercial climbing, with critics blaming inexperienced clients, profit-driven guides, and overcrowding on the mountain. Some survivors, like John Krakauer, wrote about the experience, exposing the chaos and poor decisions that led to the disaster. Others, like Anatoly Bukriv, defended their actions, insisting that everyone had done their best in impossible conditions. What's undeniable is that Everest had sent a message. Climbing to the top is one thing. Getting back down is another.